So he goes on to ask then, how do you know what consciousness is and what its various states are? Well, you know this by having those states, like being in pain, and by simply attending to them through first-person introspective. Am I in pain? I don't know. Let me do a whole bunch of tests before I answer that question. Ow. Okay, I'm in pain. There.
Yeah.
Test over.
Right. So that's kind of his first way to help us understand what consciousness is all about, right? This distinction between how we describe physical objects and how we describe states of consciousness. Third person perspective versus first person point of view. Secondly, he says states of consciousness are best defined ostensively, right? That is by citing or pointing to specific examples. He tells us, in fact, a fairly good characterization of consciousness is this. Consciousness is what you are aware of when you engage in first-person introspection, right? So that's the idea. He gives us a list of 5 kinds of conscious states that he says exist. First, there is sensation, right? This is a state of awareness or sentience, right? So, for instance, he says it's a conscious awareness of a sound or a pain, something like that, right? That's sensation. Thought is a mental semantic content that can be expressed in a sentence. So that's the belief is a person's view, accepted in various degrees of strength, it's of how things really are. So belief is what the way we think things are, right? That's belief. Desire, he tells us, is a certain inclination to do or have or experience certain things or to avoid them. And then active will is a choice. It's an exercise of power or endeavoring to act, usually for the sake of some purpose. So these 5 things then, sensation, thought, belief, desire, and act of the will are what he calls the 5 kinds of conscious states.
So hopefully you can see that going towards his point that he's making is, well, where do you do your testing on those things? Where do you find the ability to, put it in a centrifuge and separate it from its parts? Where do you put it under a microscope? Well, it doesn't seem like you are able to. All right, so then he goes on to this case of property dualism and the case for the immaterial nature of consciousness. So are properties such as being in pain or having a thought or states and events composed of them, specific pain or thinking of an event, generally mental or are they physical? What is their real nature, he says. Property dualism is the view that conscious properties, events are mental and not physical. Right, so think of an elephant. Well, you can't go into someone's brain and then root around and all of a sudden you come up with this, clay object of an elephant. All you're getting is synapses firing. And so you have to ask them, are you thinking of an elephant? And they tell you yes. And there you go. Like that's pretty much it. And so these 2 types of events are the physical brain, but they're manifesting non-physical mental states.
Right. And so he's going to make a case here that consciousness is different from physical reality, right? That's what he's really getting at here. And so he says before he gets to that, though, we need to take note of what he calls the law of identity. And it's a sophisticated way of making common everyday point. And what's the point? Well, here's the basic idea, kind of the argument for it. He says, if X is identical to Y, right? If X is the same thing as Y, then whatever is true of X is also true of Y. And whatever is true of Y is also true of X. So that's what he calls the law of identity. So if it's true of Tony that he is a, teacher, and he's also a husband, well, so if Tony is teacher and Tony is husband, if we're identical, Tony as teacher and Tony as husband are identical, then whatever is true of Tony as teacher is also true of Tony as husband, right? That's the law of identity. So notice now what he does with this. He says, if we can find one thing true or possibly true of X that is not true or possibly true of Y, then they're not the same thing. They're not identical. They violate the law of identity, even if one of the 2 depends on the other for its function. So that's the basis here. So, and what he's going to argue here then is that he's going to show us several ways where, mental consciousness type things are different than the physical things. And since they are, then they're not identical. So that's where he's going.
Right. And so he says, if there's just one, if there's one righteous person, then it won't be the identity. And so what he does is he's going to give us 5. So, going above and beyond for the extra credit there.